Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Marissa Kozlov. It is great to have you with us for today's eMarketer Tech Talk, where we host guests from all areas of media, ad tech, and martech. Today, we're talking about how to balance brand building with demand generation efforts. And I have two very special guests with me today that I'd like to introduce you to. First, we have Jason Gladu, president of Avani Media. Jason, nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Very happy to have you here. We also have Eboni Ryan, vice president of marketing at Digitalzone. Ebony, so nice to see you too.
Excited to be here.
Well, we're thrilled to have both of you as well as all of you in our audience. So just as a reminder, it's Friday. Let's keep it conversational during our time together today. So if you have any questions for Ebony or for Ryan, just put them in the chat window on the right-hand side of the screen, and we will do our best to get to as many as possible today. So please keep those questions coming. We always love to hear from you. So we have a great conversation planned, which I'm very excited for. So Ebony, I'm going to pass it to you to get started.
Awesome. Thanks, Marissa. Appreciate it. So before we dive into the content, I wanted to just kind of ground us in why I and Jason have any business talking to you guys about brand and demand, just to kind of offer a little bit of credibility for us as we navigate this content, but also just to give you guys an idea of where we're all coming from. Jason, you want to just give a quick introduction of who you are and why you're talking about this today?
Sure. So I'm Jason Gladu. I run a B2B focused marketing agency. I've spent the last 15 years at the agency side, publisher side, brand side, and now back working and running a B2B marketing agency where all we do is think about how we pair brand dollars to drive demand and do this closed loop reporting so we can see ROI all the way through.
That's awesome. And we've worked very closely together at Digitalzone, so I can definitely attest to his expertise in this area. I lead the marketing team at Digitalzone, which is a demand gen, B2B demand gen company. So I actively think as I'm leading the marketing about our brand, but also very much about the product that we offer in the demand gen space, and kind of connecting all of those dots for us as a marketing organization. Okay, so that's a little bit about us. So let's dive into the actual content here. So I think we have all experienced the new world that we live in. And surprisingly enough, I'm not actually talking about the pandemic world or the post-pandemic world that we all experienced, but more so about the workforce. So recently, the rise of the millennial workforce has kind of been in full effect, and it's had a lot of impact on how we work. And B2B is no different. As of a recent study this past year, 65% of B2B buyers are millennial or younger. And this is not just B2B people, B2B humans. These are the actual buyers or within the buying committee are millennial or younger, which is huge, right? 44% of millennial buyers would rather not deal with a sales rep at all. There's a handful of other really fun statistics about millennials' thoughts and opinions on the sales organization in the B2B area. So, and most of them speak to the fact that we're just not big fans of being prodded by sales. And we would rather kind of choose our own adventure in how we navigate through the funnel. And then 17% of the B2B purchase journey is spent with sales reps, which again kind of speaks to this digital fluency that us as millennials have, and that we look on Google, we're looking on TikTok, we're educating ourselves first. And so the sales org has such a smaller portion of our time and attention, which then as marketers means there's a lot more that we need to do to make up that other 83% of where our buyers are spending their time. So it's a different world that we live in. It's no longer possible for it just to be a sales-led organization for B2B. It needs to be more marketing centric in so many ways. And if you're familiar with a marketing organization, you know that these kind of two terms or these two teams at minimum exist in the org. Brand marketing is typically what we think of this long growing awareness, affinity over time. This is the long game, is generally what brand marketers are held to. And then demand marketers are really those quick wins, right? The driving the short-term conversions, the outcomes. They are honestly generally more tied to the immediate ROI, is that demand marketing part of the organization. what we're finding is that silos just don't work anymore. Oftentimes in a marketing organization, brand and demand kind of come up against each other in a big way, and vie for different KPIs and different ways in which they measure themselves. And the reality is that the B2B consumer doesn't experience brand siloed from demand, right? They're just experiencing your organization or your brand as a whole, right? So what we're finding and what we're kind of seeing a lot with our clients, and what Avani has often seen as well, is that these have to be married together and have to be working together to really move the business forward and really tell more meaningful stories in the market. So we kind of have three thoughts and ideas around how we move brand and demand to being a little bit more connected, and to kind of drive forward the business overall, with the first one being rooted in really measurement. Right. So anchoring marketing investment in key business objectives is kind of the thing to do. Oftentimes as marketers, we can get caught up in our marketing bubble and create marketing objectives that are not inherently connected to the business objectives. And then those, even if there is like larger marketing department objectives that ladder directly up to those business objectives, there's often a bit of a disconnect once you break down into the teams. So brand marketers aren't necessarily laddering up perfectly to those marketing objectives that then ladder up to business objectives. It's a lot of Russian nesting dolls that happens when it comes to KPIs. And what we're kind of saying here, to marry up brand and demand, there needs to be true marketing objectives that then trickle down directly into those teams that ultimately have them working towards the same idea. So we need to have shared outcomes that are both on brand and demand side, rather than the brand navigating different KPIs than the demand, and then them kind of working in opposition of each other's forward movement. Really what we've kind of boiled it down to is these 5 focus areas of KPIs that will generally help to align both your brand and demand portions of the marketing department. So thinking of awareness and how both brand and demand can contribute to awareness, perception, partnership, sales, and of course, lifetime value are all really important KPIs that, depending on the organization and where you're at, they'll look different. But these 5 ones are kind of ones that bubble to the top as being the easiest to have shared outcomes across brand and demand. And kind of rooting this in something that is historically a more demand gen centric idea is intent data. If you are in demand gen at all, this is definitely a word that has become buzzier by the minute. And so it's probably something that you're applying to your marketing right now. And this is something in a study, or in our experience, we recently saw that the implications of intent data are not siloed to not siloed to demand. You often need brand team thinking and strategically working to make sure that there's intent, that your intent works. There's a recent study by Harvard Business Review that said 80% of B2B buyers come in before they even put fingers to keyboard to start looking into vendors. They have what they are calling a day one list. This means that before intent is even on their radar, right? Because the intent signals are coming from the ways in which they navigate the internet. So before they even put fingers to keyboards to make their first search for a vendor, they already have their shortlist. And of those 80% of B2B buyers who have that shortlist, 90% of them will go with someone from their day one list, which is incredible information to know as a marketer. But it shows like the intense implications of brand marketing on what demand gen marketing folks are using. If you're using intent data, if you're getting in at that last hour where they're showing intent, you missed the boat in being on that short list, that day one list. And so we're finding oftentimes if you have similar KPIs, if you can align and have shared outcomes across brand and demand, if increasing intent is one of your brand or your marketing outcomes that you want to see, brand has to play a heavy hand in that, because if not, there's just a lot of lost dollars spent trying to get it at the very last mile. So this is one of just the examples, again, largely generally rooted in demand gen, but there is so many implications from a brand perspective that are important for the demand gen marketer to be successful. One of the other ones is a test and learn culture. Jason, you want to talk about this?
Yeah, so I think just like thinking about how we leverage intent and how it's best leveraged between brand and demand, I think as we combine these, we really have to start thinking about what are the ways that we can test and learn and be more agile. And so we've looked at, there's about 5 different ways that we look at this. And so some of these are more straightforward than others. The most obvious one, and the one that everybody tends to lean towards, is branding creative. So think A/B testing, right? And with the change in how a lot of platforms are targeting, with the deprecation of cookies and how some walled gardens don't have as much data as you might once have had, you're now having to think about, instead of testing 4 iterations of an ad, how do I need to test 200 iterations to really find the one that drives the most value? We often recommend that clients of ours or anybody running marketing is looking, somewhere between 10 and 20% of budget being allocated to testing, depending on how mature your marketing machine is. We can look at things like spend allocation, where we think about where in the funnel we're testing and what's going to drive the most success for us as a company. Channel mix is another relatively obvious one. When we think about what have we always done, what do we have good data on, what are some new channels that we can get on, what are some new vendors out there that we haven't been able to test? Because as you continue to spend marketing dollars quarter over quarter, year over year on the same channels, with the same publishers, with the same audiences, you're going to start seeing those diminishing returns. You're going to start seeing CPMs rise. You're going to start seeing conversion rates fall. And the only way that you're going to continue to move the needle from a marketing perspective is to find those new audiences, or find new ways to engage with the old audiences that you've already hit a million times with banners. Thinking about, tracking and targeting, this is one where we start thinking about, as we marry brand and demand, how do we think about those metrics? How do we not assign revenue to brand activation, but how do we have KPIs that we can easily justify for our brand activations and sell into the CFO or sell into the CEO? And then ultimately, the last one is, incentives and urgency. How do we test what is going to work for different segments of our audience, whether that's industry based, right? We can't necessarily run, incentivized sales call or an incentivized trial to somebody that works, in Fed and SLED. So what can we do to create urgency there that is going to look different than how we do that with some of the other sectors that we might play in? And the big key here is we have to remain agile. And so as the marketing teams sort of come together and really think more holistically, it's not about setting and forgetting. It's about, how do we become an agile unit that is continually taking the feedback from, from our funnel, and ultimately, hopefully, from sales, and from those conversations and that feedback, and feeding it back into sort of the campaign and execution machine that we've developed.
And one of the ways, kind of leading up back to the KPIs that are established, right, are kind of diving a little bit deeper. And this was where it tends to become a little bit more brand and demand is, but if you have these overall marketing objectives that are naturally going to ladder up to those business objectives, each of your teams also need to have these leading and lagging indicators. And this is really just words for basically all of the dominoes that have to fall before you get to success in those objectives from a marketing and business perspective, right? So the example that we have here for the leading indicator is the number of ad impressions will lead to increased brand awareness. If brand awareness is the marketing objective, right, and you're trying to increase brand awareness, or maybe you're trying to increase brand awareness in a certain market, right, there is a leading indicator that will come very quickly of the number of ad impressions that lead to increased brand awareness. Keeping an eye on those leading indicators, and then also likewise keeping an eye on the lagging indicators, that ultimately another domino that's falling towards this brand awareness goal of an increase in brand awareness will result in contact us form fills, right? So there's all these different leading and lagging indicators that generally are associated with all of the test and learn levers that Jason spoke about, right? I can test and learn with the amount of ad spend that I'm doing within ad impressions, or increase and change the way that the creative is on those ads. All of those test and learn levers are really directly tied to these leading and lagging indicators, which ultimately help you keep your finger on the pulse of whether or not you're moving in a positive trajectory towards those marketing objectives that ladder up to business ones. So these are just kind of call outs to, we have to keep our finger on the pulse. We're not just testing willy-nilly. We're not just testing to test, right? Even in that 10 to 20% of the budget that we secure for testing, we're testing with a purpose. We want to make sure that there's very clear leading and lagging indicators in the ways that are built into our test to ensure that we are marching towards those business objectives and marketing objectives for the year. And really, in this idea of KPIs and measurement and test and learn, at the heart of it all is data, right? And we very strongly believe at Digitalzone and at Avani that every data point matters. And it's been interesting because I came into this role at Digitalzone about a year ago, and demand gen was actually relatively new market for me, or industry for me. And one of the things when I was kind of peeling back the onion that is content syndication was there was so much data that was being left on the table for marketers. And as historically a B2B marketer myself, it was just really eye-opening to me is how much more meaningful decisions I could make if that data was brought to the surface. So we use like an HQL campaign as an example. In this example, we send out a piece of content and the person has to be in the market for your product, right? If you're familiar with content syndication, if you're familiar with HQL campaigns, you know this to be true. And then your vendor gives you this lead that has interacted with your piece of content and has expressed they are in the market for what you do right now. And so one of the things that we had been working on is this idea of like, but what about all of the people who said they weren't in the market? Those demand gen marketers aren't getting that data and information. And for me as a demand gen marketer with a targeted account list for the year, if all 5 of the people from this one account are all saying that they're not in the market for what I offer this year, it's incredible data for me to have, because then I can focus and shift my test and learn. I can focus and shift my KPIs for that particular account. And it just becomes an enriched experience for me as a marketer, not to just know the folks that are perfectly intent and checking the box, yes, I'm in the market for what you have to offer, but also the folks who are not in the market or not quite sure, or don't have the budget, or maybe they only interacted with your education piece but not your promo piece. And all of those data points that feel imperfect are actually really illuminating as marketers and allow for even better test and learn levers to be pulled to become more and more accurate and create better experiences for our prospects and clients, knowing the whole picture and not just the perfect one as marketers that we tend to prefer, but also all of the things that are going to make us be on their day one list when they are in the market for what it is that we offer. So again, this data forward idea is really at the heart of KPIs. It's at the heart of test and learn, and it's really at the heart of marrying up brand and demand. All right, so the third one that we have is really putting the customer at the center. Jason?
Yeah, I think overall, the more that we focus on the customer, we know that the buying journey is not linear. As much as we want it to be, as much as all the whiteboard sessions we do show it to be linear, we know that's not the case. And so as we think about that customer, their interactions with our content, how we think about reaching them, we have to root all of our planning, all of our opportunities with them at the center. And so we think about how maybe some of our siloed organizations used to operate, right? We've got these independent funnels that are happening. We've got potentially a funnel for demand. We've got a funnel for awareness. We've got different product line funnels. We're really focused on our products and our story as a business and less about the customer and their problems and their story. We're talking about not really being able to track things. We've got this really rigid, what I would call waterfall, non-agile planning process, so that when we kick something off, we kind of set it and forget it. Or you think about this very traditional ad agency approach of like, I just need to put a lot of dollars with one publisher, get it off my books. And so I'm going to do what's best for me instead of what's best for the customer. And then we've got these just really marketing focused KPIs that aren't really tied to the business. And I think, we posit there's a better way to do this, a more integrated way, a way that focuses on the customer journey, that focuses on the customer, that talks about how do we make sure we're agile? How do we make sure we're iterative in this process? Because we know that the minute we put pen to paper, the minute we build out our perfect little flow chart for the quarter of our plan, next week it is going to completely change because we've identified, as Ebony mentioned, some of this new data, all of the data that's coming in. We've identified there's a better way to engage. There's a better avenue in order to drive more customer value. And so as we build this integrated planning journey, ultimately, and one of the more important parts of this is laddering our spend, our ideas, our metrics up to our business KPIs such that we can show we are driving the business forward.
And really in this integrated approach, right, we're ultimately what we're trying to create is better experiences, like Jason mentioned, right? Like we're trying to make it less about us as marketers, though we do love to hear ourselves talk. We want to make it more about the people that we're actually speaking to, right? And so with more data, with really clear KPIs, and with putting the customer at the center, we're able to create more meaningful experiences. Again, rooted in something that is largely demand gen or considered demand gen is this idea of nurture, right? Once the leads come in, you then need to have some sort of nurture sequence. And oftentimes what we're finding is that folks generally only have one nurture that they put everybody in. And what we're kind of saying is the better way, right? The customer-centric way is to create better segments in that nurture, whether it's segmenting them by job function, whether it's segmenting them by the content that they interacted with, what comes next, or even the sub industries within the target accounts that you're looking at, right? So creating a little bit more of a personalized, curated experience based on who these folks are, rather than a one size fits all nurture. And oftentimes this can feel really overwhelming because maybe you have like 10, 12, 20 segments that come out the other side of your lead gen efforts. But there's a very baby steps approach, right? You can use the same content, change the subject line. Maybe you change the first couple sentences within the email nurture for each of these segments. You're not necessarily having to generate perfectly net new content for all of these segments, but really framing up what you're offering to them, the value exchanges you're offering them, to maybe meet their needs a little bit more clearly, so that they engage in your nurture in a more meaningful way, and they feel like you're curating a better experience for who they are and what they want and how they would want to interact with your brand. So like I mentioned at the top, Jason and I have worked together many times before, and Digitalzone and Avani are good friends. And one of the things that we really appreciate about our partnership with Avani is that oftentimes they are on our side with us and working with their clients to really create value in the market rather than noise. If there's anything that the pandemic did was create a lot of digital noise. And so breaking through that digital noise that we're all getting bombarded with is really important. And that's something that we've seen in the way that Avani and Digitalzone have been able to work together on behalf of our clients.
Yeah, and I think, this entire, case study, if you will, really does center around what Ebony was talking about in having more data and the ability to nurture. So we had a virtualization client who was driving leads, but kind of struggling to get a really good grasp of their ICP. They weren't getting those right folks coming through the door. And the ones that were coming through the door were having trouble continuing the conversation. And what we did with our friends over at Digitalzone was really sit down and segment the data, go through the first party data that not only Digitalzone had, but that we had access through our client, and think about the ways that in which we could engage that audience, put the right content in front of them, but then also continue to nurture them along. Because what Digitalzone was really great at was uncovering those extra data points, taking those that aren't in market, and then being able to send more emails, have some more conversations on the phone with some of these prospects to really understand what is going on inside of the company. You obviously downloaded, you engaged with some content around virtualization, but you're not in the market for it. What's the pain? What's the problem? How can our client potentially help you? Or maybe figure out where you're at in your journey. Maybe you're trying to look for an analyst report. And that sort of program that, took about 12 to 15 weeks, really boosted the lead acceptance rate by sales. It was well over 80%. And the sales team was excited to get on these conversations. They had a lot of information, but more importantly, those leads, those prospects were coming through the door in a way that was warm, that they knew what was going on. And whether or not they were super familiar with our our client, they were more aware of their challenge and they could speak to it clearly. And so we could have a very good call and sort of identify next steps, whether that was a project with our virtualization client or potentially just helping them out in another area.
And so, really, kind of bringing this all, recapping it, summarizing everything that we've said today, we deeply believe in marrying brand and demand, and that holistic strategy and go to market is really what we feel like is going to make marketing teams and businesses win. And that kind of boils down to the 3 points that we discussed today, which was one, anchoring marketing investment in key business objectives, establishing a test and learn culture at your organization and specifically in your marketing department, and of course, putting the customer at the center, making it less about us and the business and what we love to say as marketers and more about what our clients love to hear and where they're at in the near term. I will just put a shameless plug for the ebook that we've recently done called Beyond Ordinary. And it has a lot of the data points that I mentioned and a bunch of other research that we've done on this topic. So invite you to use the QR code on the screen, or I believe it's in the chat somewhere as well. But yeah, thanks so much. Marissa, back over to you. I think we have questions.
Yes, thank you so much. That was excellent. I just so enjoyed hearing the two of you speak. It is very clear that you work very, very well together and have known each other for quite some time. So thank you so much for sharing more around really that key theme that you both mentioned a few times of marrying the brand and demand, how to build that test and learn culture, and also the opportunity to drive more customer value. So let's get right to the questions. We have a number that have come through. The first one is, how are you using data to improve brand loyalty without creeping out the customer? Ebony, what do you think about that one?
Yeah, it's a great question. We definitely don't want to be creepy, but really, what we're trying to do, what we're doing, is more of segmentation, right? So we're not necessarily talking about their pet Fluffy, and so kind of creeping them out on that level, but more so like hitting them up at what they feel like their business issues are at the time. And generally, that personalization for us at Digitalzone is going to come at the account level, right? So if you are a B2B company, things that might be happening in the market for you in that particular time. The other thing that we feel strongly about is creating some guardrails around display retargeting. Retargeting is one of those things that can be super creepy as to how much this ad follows you around the internet and for how long. So we have really strict guidelines on that sort of following around the internet experience that we offer for our clients, to make sure that we're creating an experience that the potential prospect will enjoy and will delight them, and will also not create this negative connotation with your brand, right? So we consult a lot. It is definitely business to business that you create these rules for them, because there are definitely benchmarks and things that we go off of, but that is kind of the idea, is that we're speaking more of the account level. We're not talking about your last Target trip or your dog, but more focused on how we can help you in your business role that helps us to remain uncreepy.
I can hear your chuckle, right? Because I think we all know that feeling of when we think, well, how did they know? Or why are they following me around? Jason, any thoughts from you on that one?
I agree. I think it's the personalization has to be very well done. And I've found the most success is when you can show the person the ad, but you're talking about the business and their challenges and being able to dynamically adjust the ad based on industry or based on something that happened in their industry, like Ebony said. That's where I found the most success, even across the social channels where people might not be engaging with maybe during their normal business hours. But at the end of the day, they're still human. Everybody still uses the social platforms, and they're still often, as we all usually are, thinking about our business and our challenges.
Okay, thank you. Great perspectives from both of you. Jason, the next question is for you. If I'm just starting to test and learn, do any business KPIs matter more than others, or are all KPIs considered equal? What do you think?
I don't think they're all equal. I do think it depends on what you're testing. And so if we think about creative for a minute, usually we're going to be looking at something like cost per lead or CPA, something like that. I don't tend to like a click-through rate as a metric, because at the end of the day, we really care about some of those more down funnel metrics. When we're thinking about some other areas, whether that's channel efficacy or thinking about different publishers, we really are using benchmarks, because we know, especially in B2B, the sales cycles are often very long. And so this would be a very different conversation if this was an e-commerce play, if we're selling t-shirts or something in the B2C space where we can look at those more immediate conversions. In the B2B space, we know that it's going to take far too long. So we might think about things like, how much of the account list are we actually hitting? How many of our target personas are coming through on this channel with this activation? And so you have to get a little more creative, in my mind, with some of these metrics. But I will say every test should have a metric, and it's sort of go or no go line in the sand. Like, if we don't meet this threshold, we kill it after 14 days or whatever the case is.
Thank you for sharing that on those KPIs. Ebony, our next viewer has a question for you about experiential marketing. So where does that fit into the brand to demand continuum?
Yeah, so I think that we all, after the pandemic or through the pandemic, we were all desperate to be in person, and have more meaningful experiential things and with engagements with brands, right? So I would say that there are a lot of folks who are tired of getting ebooks. There are a lot of folks who are tired of doing things digitally and want to have those experiences that transverse digital and into our real lived experiences. I think that they marry up perfectly. And I think that really the strategy for those has to be done together, because what is very difficult to do in the real world is measure every element, every touch point of those. And so when you can link back your experiential, your activations, your in-person activations back to a digital element, to kind of capture those touch points, to kind of capture and measure and test and learn through the way that you connect your in-person and digital experiences, that's going to be kind of the biggest win. We have done We're actually about to do a direct mail campaign, which is very hard often to track the success of, but we are marrying it up with a digital component, to hopefully see if we got it right, and that this was the right medium, this is the right campaign, but again, connecting it to digital is going to be what really helps us to know whether or not it was successful.
All right, thank you. Another one for you. At the top of the presentation today, you gave some nice data points about millennials specifically, and we know that millennials have very different viewpoints about how brands communicate with their customers. So our next viewer wants to know if being eco-friendly builds loyalty or distinguishes a brand with millennials in particular.
That's a great question. Sustainability is definitely a much bigger topic for millennials than it has in past generations. And just like from a global perspective, we've found that EMEA in particular is very leaned into the conversation, particularly millennials in EMEA are very leaned into the conversation around sustainability. So if you're in the EMEA market, you should definitely make sure you have a very clear perspective on sustainability if you're trying to reach the millennial or Gen Z. But in the US, it varies really. I think what is more important than anything is being genuine as a brand, because I really feel that millennials can really sniff out if you're just, putting on a face of sustainability, but don't really have an organization that truly believes in that message and is actually doing something in the world about it. So what I would recommend for anyone considering sustainability is to make sure that it is actually relevant with your organization before you kind of go and take the stage with any sort of stance on sustainability. Because having an eco-friendly water bottle at your trade show booth is not going to be what sets you apart, right? It's going to have to be in the DNA of your organization for it to move the needle for you, particularly for millennials.
All right, thank you for that and your perspective on millennials and sustainability. Jason, our next viewer asks, I worry there's such a thing as too much testing. What kind of testing guardrails do you recommend?
I agree. I think there is, I think people can get into the mode of too much testing. It's almost a form of procrastination, if you will. Um, I like to recommend a segment of the budget. So generally 10 to 15%, depending on size of budget, activations, history of the brand, what we're trying to accomplish, we might go a little bit higher. Um, the one thing I will say is, obviously this doesn't touch on UX and UI testing, which I think you've got to be very careful about, because you can test and optimize for it'll take a lot of effort for very marginal gains. And so I always just like to say, let's set a budget amount, and also make sure that we know what we're trying to learn, right? If we don't have anything to learn, if we're not sure what we're trying to achieve, then there's no point in testing, because again, we won't have those KPIs, we won't have the benchmark, we won't have the go no go line. Not a definitive answer, because I think it depends on each organization, but to my clients, I tell them often 10 to 15%.
Yeah, I would
point.
have to agree with the whole knowing the objective, right? Like, why are we testing? We're not just testing the color for funsies, right? Like, we are testing it for a reason. My educational background is in biology and chemistry. And so the scientific method is just running in my brain all the time. And so when I approach testing, it's always from a hypothesis, right? Like, there's something that I think is true, and I want to test to see if I'm right or wrong. And so I would totally agree that, like, you have to know why you are testing. Is there a question? Is there an itch you're trying to scratch? Is there a question you're trying to get answered for yourself and for your organization before you go into it? Because then you can be really specific about the variables in which you're testing. Because to Jason's point, there is a threshold of too many things that you're testing at once. Because if you throw too many variables in the mix, you're not going to actually know what answered your question, right? So having that really clear hypothesis or objective, whatever language you prefer, is important to make sure that your test was a yes or no, essentially, at the end of it.
Okay, thank you. Jason, you talked about the B2B sales cycle. So I want to put this next one over to you. What kind of content do you think works best on LinkedIn, either organic or paid, when we think about B2B?
It's a good question. I think there's a variety of pieces of content that work, and I think a lot of it comes down to sort of creative and execution, right? Creative is going to be the over 50% of the targeting, right, in most cases, right, where you're really connecting with that buyer. So I think if you want tactical advice, I think like the thought leadership ads are starting to be very interesting. Seeing good results from those, where you've got companies sharing or sort of boosting or promoting some of their employees' posts that are written in a way that has a clear CTA, and sort of is more text-based, maybe with a video. I think LinkedIn can be challenging, right? It can become very expensive, and depending on where you're at in your ABM journey, if you try and go load up a list of 5,000 people, right, like you've got their email addresses and you want to target them, your CPMs are going to be very, very expensive, and not everybody's on LinkedIn all the time. And so I always just cautious people and tell them you've got to be careful with the audience size. And then the ad creative is going to be very, very important. I think that extends past just LinkedIn. And I wanted to touch on the ESG thing just for a moment, largely because I think one thing we do as B2B marketers, and what we see a lot with B2B brands, is we get very, very focused on speeds and feeds and sort of like very, very nitty gritty. And we forget that at the end of the day, the person or the group of people in the buying committee are people, right? They want a story. They want to feel connected to the brand. And so instead of just saying, yes, we're number 16 on the ESG list and, list on the FTSE 100 or whatever it is, right? Like tell the story, show us the visual, create the narrative, tell the story about how your product is eco-friendly, or it works really well, and the story of your customer who's using it in a very specific fashion. Those sorts of stories, which probably are more couched in brand, will really help engage the community and focus on hopefully hitting some of your target accounts, and then hopefully some of those will be in market.
Yeah, I think the thing that comes to mind as far as content on different channels is the audience is really important. We said it already, like in every single point, but putting the customer, the audience at the core is really important. I think of just in my own life, I'm a marketer through and through, and my husband is in cybersecurity. So he's in the IT space, and we have 3 kids in common, and that's kind of it. What he looks at on the internet is completely different than what I do. He's like a Reddit guy. I'm a Pinterest girl. Like there couldn't be more differences in the way that we engage with content and creative and everything in between. It has to be pretty if you're going to send it to me. He doesn't care, right? So I think that those differences are very clear in the audiences. And generally, if you can focus on who are these humans that I'm trying to get in front of? What are they looking for? Doesn't really even matter what channel. Of course, you want to choose the channels that they're present on. But as long as they're on those channels and you're thinking first, like what this person cares about, that's what's going to resonate. That's the content. So knowing your audience is really at the core of the answer of that. And so it's not this like one size fits all thing, like do a report and everyone will read it. It's not true, right? So like know your audience, know what they want, know where they're at, and then do that. I think tends to be the best case for content.
All right. Thank you both. That was really, really detailed answers from both of you. So thank you so much. I hope that was helpful to our viewer as well. Ebony, earlier I asked you about experiential. So now I'm going to ask you about in-person events. Can content and in-person events work hand in hand to improve conversion efforts, or do they risk competing with each other?
I definitely think they work hand in hand. I think it's the same as experiential. Like you have to have a digital component generally to connect it back to those touch points. We have largely seen, and in our in-person events that we've done in this last year, which I will definitely encourage marketers, especially B2B marketers, to be at these in-person events because they are thriving right now as we're all like jonesing to see humans again. But the things that we're doing at these in-person events are largely digital as well. And we have been very intentional about how we promote our in-person presence at these events in digital ways, and then connecting that to then having in-person interactions with these folks that we then in person have a digital component like the QR code that we showed you guys earlier, right? We have those digital components to kind of, yes, they attended this session and we got them as a lead, but did they interact with the ebook that we then promoted at the session? Or did they come by the booth and then scan a different QR code to have a different touch point? So for me, I came into marketing in the digital era. So there's, in my mind, always has to be a digital component. It just makes my life easier from a measurement and success drives or data-driven opportunities for us, right? So for me, in-person, experiential, all of these things are really fun, but if it's always going to be connected to one, a larger campaign, and also have definite digital touch points, even in person.
Okay, well, thanks for connecting the dots on all of those opportunities. We have time for one more question today. Jason, our next viewer asks, how can I avoid focusing too narrowly on intent data and keep my strategy on track?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic. I think, like Ebony mentioned, sort of in the presentation, a lot of people come into the equation with a short list, and unless you're a massive brand, you risk not being on it, even if they're in market. And so, one of the things that I like to think about is using intent data is fantastic. What I think would be a really interesting application is looking at what accounts you're reaching from your brand strategy and then overlaying it with those that are in market and seeing what that sort of cross section is, because then I at least have a shot. They at least sort of know who I am. And so I'm not wasting all of my dollars on 100 people who have already made up their mind on somebody else. So it does, you see this often with, especially in sort of these economic cyclical times where everybody's pushing for like stuff to close tomorrow, leads coming in that are ready to buy with credit card in hand. And unless you're on that short list, it's going to be almost certainly a waste of dollars to spend money just at the bottom of the funnel. And so I like to marry my intent strategy with a full funnel approach, and then get creative about how we leverage some of the data that we're seeing in each stage with intent to drive more sort of throughput.
Yeah,
Thank
I think
you.
even to layer onto that, for me, when it comes to brand and demand, the simplest thing, like it's woven into all the 3 points that we said, is like just like talk to each other and stuff. Like that's kind of like the biggest part, right? Like if I'm overemphasizing my intent data and I'm coming up short with conversions, I need to kind of surface that back to the brand team and say like, hey guys, we're finding that our intent's not working. There's probably something on the brand side that we need support in. That two-way conversation between brand and demand is also super critical, because then if the brand team is doing a big brand push, great. A month or two later, we'll do a big intent push. So those timings of those things is also, I think, really important to make sure that things are aligning so that you, like Jason was saying, you're not wasting money on things when you're not like talking to each other and kind of servicing those insights to one another.
Okay, thank you both so much. It was so wonderful to be with you, Avani, Jason, for the great content that you provided us with today, and especially for answering all of those questions. Thank you to our audience for engaging with us. We really appreciate you both being here. It was so much fun to hang out with you on a Friday.
It was a pleasure to be here, Marissa. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So before we wrap up today, I'm just going to take a moment to tell you a little bit more about what's happening with eMarketer and our upcoming events. You can join us next Friday, November 3rd, for Attention, our half-day live virtual summit focused on trends and predictions for 2024. Registration is now open on our events page. And while you're on that page, you can sign up for some additional live analyst and tech talk webinars. So we hope to see you there. And finally, keep an eye on your email for the link to today's recording. Thank you all for your time. Thanks again to Avani, Jason, the team at Digitalzone, and our Studio II crew, our production team behind the scenes, for making this webinar possible today. We'll see you all on the next Tech Talk.